Good morning, everyone. I didn't know that Leanne has such a long introduction. I would have asked to cut it short so I can spend more time on the presentation. So this is actually a research study done by my colleague Laura Sprague from the Zero Project, and some of the findings were so interesting that the Zero Project reached out to Transgender Law Center trying to make some sense into the findings of this, and that's how this came about. As you probably have heard multiple times during this conference, transgender women, the meta-analysis in 15 countries showed that transgender women bear the burden of HIV, and it's 49 times higher than general populations. And I think that there are a lot of reasons for that, and this is just a glimpse of what it might be. And when we talk about respondents and what they have said during the studies, and these are some of the actual quote. In order to file charges, I would have had to disclose my rape, my HIV status, and I would have to give up my privacy and be subjected to public scrutiny. And this is a transgender woman living with HIV who's like 60 years old or older. And the other quote we have is, I was the one charged. There was absolutely no physical contact, simply saying yes to sex after 9 months in jail in a front page news article in hopes that someone would come forward. The charges were dropped. Not before my reputation, both professionally and personal, was ruined. And this is another transgender woman in the US. And this is also not a unique experience for most people living with HIV, because when they're being charged or criminalized, their medical privacies would be compromised because of media attention. And when we looked at the purpose of this study, the study was led by Zero Project, a network of people living with HIV in the US, and I had the honor to be one of the board members fighting for human rights and against stigma and discrimination. And the purpose was to understand the views of people living with HIV in our broader communities about the use of the criminal law when a person living with HIV is accused of HIV non-disclosure, perceived exposure, or transmission. And the study was also conducted online, and it was distributed quite widely throughout multiple communities and also multiple PLHIV network in the US. And some hard copies were also distributed to participants who have no access to the computer. And the study itself, it lasts about 20 to 30 minutes, and it is anonymous, and also it has gotten the IRB approval through Eastern Michigan University. And here are some of the results. The actual total number of respondents is a little over 3,000, and although we only have 2% who identify as either transgender or third sex, which is pretty much consistent with our US estimations of how large the transgender population is. And among them, we're lucky enough to actually have a fairly good distributions of both, transgender men, transgender women, and also some of them who identified as third sex. And out of this, we will focus mostly, from the rest of this presentation, we'll focus on transgender people who are living with HIV. And as you see the breakdown here, it shows that the HIV burden is higher for transgender women than for transgender men, and also those who are identified as either gender nonconforming, third sex, or genderqueer. So we're talking about a disabling legal environment, and And in general, we find that this is not because people don't know the laws, but rather because the laws are so broadly written and so arbitrarily enforced that people can't guess what they need to do to protect themselves. And here are some of the questions that was asked. And this one is about, do you feel confident that you could protect yourself legally from accusations that you engage in sexual behavior without disclosing your HIV positive status? If you look at it, the light green bar represent transgender respondents' answer, and over 50% actually was not confident that they would be protected legally. And later on, I think that we can have discussions on why this is the situation compared to just cis men and cis women in this study. And this slide, the question is, have you ever worried about being falsely accused, not disclosing your HIV status? And less than 50% have answered these questions as saying never. And over 50% actually is almost 57% have responded to say that they have doubts that they would not be falsely accused, not disclosing their HIV status. And this slide's the question is, do you believe a person living with HIV could get a fair hearing in their state? If you know about US laws, each state have their own HIV criminalization statutes, and it varies from state to state. Some actually is under public health law, some is under penal code, and some are would include or consider intent, but most states don't. And when we ask that if they think they would get a fair hearing in their states if accused or not disclosing his or her HIV status to the sexual partner, and when you look at the response, that 52%, actually most of them are pretty high, and 52% of the transgender people do not think that they would get a fair hearing, and only about 14% that would say that they'll probably get a fair hearing. And that's not much of faith invested in the justice system. And here are some of the response from the respondents, and why, and to talk about why and why not. As a post-trans woman, I find it doubtful that I would be given a fair hearing in any court of law. And this is a trans woman in her 20s. And this other quote, because although the state has become fairly tolerant with regards to LGBT community, there is still a lot of intolerance when it comes to transgender community that extends to the court system. So you see that it's not really directly about HIV, it's more about gender identity, like our previous speakers had alluded to. And as for being transgender, we have been treated very badly by the system here. And we'll move on to HIV disclosure. So this is specifically about HIV disclosure, although disclosure, it's complicated for the transgender community, and I think that plays a part in that, and we can have a discussion on that also. And should a person living with HIV disclose her or his status to a potential sexual partner before engaging in sexual activities? If you look at the context of it, we're really looking at, contextually, why they need to disclose and not disclose. And, and it's only a very small percentage that says that they always have to disclose. And most of them, answer is depends on circumstances or, and only if asked. So that is represent the majority of the transgender respondents. And the other question, should a person living with HIV who is a sex worker disclose her or his status to a client before engaging in sexual acts? And the answer to that is also not surprising for us, that it all depends on circumstances. And you will see a lot of these answers in HIV testing, treatment, and disclosure. And I think that this is actually a very interesting slide to think about. How reasonable is it to avoid testing, treatment, or disclosure because of fear of prosecution? And our hope is nobody would think that, like it's reasonable to avoid any of this because, they don't really should have a legal system hang over their shoulders, right? But surprisingly, only 39% says that it's not reasonable for a person to does not disclose his or her positive HIV status to a current partner out of fear of being prosecuted by a previous partner to whom he or she did not disclose HIV. And that really shows you where we are in terms of our faith in the entire legal system. And to really look deeper, and since I run out of time, I think that we just need to have a discussion later on, is that when it comes to disclosure, when we talk about depends on circumstances, it's really focused on the context. And this is something that when you ask any transgender person, regardless whether it's a transgender man or woman, they would probably agree that disclosure is very complicated, because one thing that this is not covering here is disclosure-related violence, which many transgender people have experienced, whether they're trans men or trans women. And also the legal vulnerability that they experience because they have not been treated fairly by those who are supposed to be there to protect them and enforce laws that keep them safe. So what we can really look at deeper is, these are some of the thoughts we have in terms of what we can do next, is we really haven't gotten some specific studies that looks deeper on the global levels on violence related to disclosure, not just HIV, but also on gender identity. And also with specific questions, addressing key populations. Of course, transgender people living with HIV is what we're focusing on this session, and that's something that we really need to look deeper into. And this is just a quote that Laurel have added in, is to the people living with HIV and members of affected community who generally share their time, thoughts, and experience with us and make this research possible. And where our hope is we can actually scale this up, to do that on a global basis, because we believe our findings would be fairly consistent regardless of which country and how advanced or high income or the income differences in the countries for the transgender community. Thank you.